Good morning. I just want to let everyone know that we are now live on YouTube.
Morning, everybody. This is Chet Parsons. We're going to wait a couple more minutes and see if our friends from the city and Hanover County join us. Okay, good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know that DRPT is planning on calling in as soon as they are able. So I think we have almost a full group this morning. I am going to share my screen so we can at least have somewhat of an agenda to follow as we lead into the main part of the meeting with the Public Transportation Plan Workshop. I'm Chet Parsons. I'm the Director of Transportation at Plan RVA, and we are convening this Public Transportation Work Group. It's a fairly new work group this year, and its sole purpose is to accentuate the conversation among TPO members and stakeholders about public transportation and what we can do to assist and emphasize the needs for public transportation in our region. One of the things that this work group is tasked to do is to assist the newly created Central Virginia Transportation Authority in its work in the public transportation realm. So that's the topic under item 3 today is to help provide resources for the CBTA as they consider development of a regional public transportation plan by GRTC. Before we get into that, though, let's start with the agenda. Because we have a lot of guests today, let's go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves. And I guess the easiest thing to do is for me to just call somebody's name. Ken, can you start?
Ken Lance with Plan RVA.
Great. Nicole?
Nicole Mueller with Plan RVA.
Adrian?
Good morning, Adrian Torres with GRTC.
All right. John O'Keefe?
John O'Keefe with Ride Finders.
Thanks, John. Barb?
Barb Smith, Chesterfield County Transportation.
Great. Darona?
Good morning, everyone. Diana Moore Clark, City of Richmond, Office of Equitable Transit and Mobility.
Thanks. Sharon?
Good morning and Happy New Year. This is Sharon Smidler with Henrico County Transportation Development.
Great. Lisa?
Good morning, Lisa Guthrie, Virginia Transit Association.
Great. Joe?
Joe Videnis with Hanover County. Sorry, I'm late joining the meeting.
No problem. I believe we have Emily?
Good morning, Emily Del Ross with GRTC.
All right. Is it Kesha? Is that right?
Yes, Keisha Reed from GRTC. Good morning.
Good morning. Dawn?
Good morning, Dawn Bailey with GRTC.
Great. Lorna?
Lorna Parkins with the consultant team, Michael Baker.
Great. Nick?
Hi, Nick Britton with Michael Baker on the consultant team as well.
Ryan?
Good morning, Ryan Ferguson with Michael Baker.
All right. Jarrett? I believe you were muted.
There we are. Sorry about that. Jarrett Walker and Associate.
Great. Scudder?
Good morning. I'm Scudder Wag with Jarrett Walker and Associates as well.
Excellent. Tiffany, are you on the line?
Yes, I apologize for being late. I'm Tiffany Dubinsky. I'm with the Department of Rail and Public Transportation.
Great. Anyone that I missed? Okay. Excellent. So moving on, the first part of the agenda, item 1, consideration of any amendments to the agenda. As I said, this is pretty fast and loose agenda today. The bulk of the meeting is going to be item 3, and A through D was what GRTC provided to us to kind of help us as we move through the meeting topics, and I'm sure the consultants on the line will break this apart as we move through it. Any other amendments to the agenda? Anything else that we need to add that anyone can think of? Okay, hearing none, we'll go on to approval of the November 2nd meeting summary. We don't need a motion or a second. If there are any changes or additions, please let those be known now. Otherwise, we will approve that meeting summary by consensus. All right, thanks everybody. So at this point, we're to item 3 on the agenda, and I would like to turn it over to Adrian to start us off. And if we need to do anything with screen sharing, let me know, and we can make that happen.
Yes, and we are going to do a screen share. If Scudder could share his screen.
Jarrett's actually, so Chet, for your information, so we're going to do a presentation. Jarrett will share his screen to start, and then I will later on in the presentation, but Adrian will speak to the first part of the presentation that Jarrett shares.
Sounds good. You should be able to share whenever you're ready.
Okay. Here we go. Alrighty. There we go. All right. So Adriana, you're speaking to this?
Yes. All right. Well, thank you everyone for participating, and we are very excited to finally kick this off after going back and forth with scope changes. So we're introducing the first of the public transportation working group in development of our regional public transportation plan. Go ahead. So what is our charge? From the legislation, GRTC shall develop a plan for regional public transportation with the MPO. GRTC shall annually provide to the authority sufficient documentation as required by the authority showing that the revenues distributed under subdivision D2 were applied in accordance with authority approval and guidelines required by 33.2286, which refers to the transit strategic plan from DRPT. So what does this mean? We will be developing a regional public transportation plan, working with you guys kind of as stakeholders in the development. We'll be collaborating through this process and following the guidelines of the transit strategic plan. We'll provide the plan of sufficient documentation to CVTA for approval of using the 15% dedicated funding. And this will be something that's done on an annual basis. So kind of the goal is FY 22 in the end for approval. So who is here? It's kind of already gone through and introduced ourselves, but from GRTC staff, we have a mix of planning and scheduling as well as finance. And then from consultant staff, we have Michael Baker and Associates as well as Jarrett Walker and Associates. And just to restate them, Lorna, Nick, and Ryan are from Michael Baker, and then Jarrett and Scudder are from Jarrett Walker and Associates.
So do you hand it over to me here? Go ahead.
Well, yeah. So one technical item is this this workshop today. We do have some interactive polling questions that we want to get people's feedback on, and the way we're going to do that is to use Turning Point rwpoll.com. So if you can, from your desktop that I think or laptop that everyone's working from today, have a separate browser open to rwpoll.com. And when you go there, it'll ask you for a session ID, and you enter the session ID 316814. That will allow you to answer some of these poll questions that we'll have during this workshop to get everyone's input so that everyone has an opportunity to answer a couple of key questions that we'll have as we're going through this process and thinking through the framework for how to design this plan. So if anyone has trouble with that, just send me a chat through the Zoom chat function, and I'll help you out.
All right. So so we're here to talk about to start thinking about this whole question about what are the rules by which this new regional funding will be distributed. And there are, broadly speaking, two big questions around this. One is if there are any rules about what kind of service is eligible for the regional money. And the other is if there are questions about how that service should be distributed. And so starting with the first one, what kind of service is regionally funded? You know, is it any transit service anywhere in the region? Or do we need to have some kind of standard of regional usefulness to make sure that we are indeed putting together a regional network rather than just distributing money to a bunch of jurisdictions that they used to do what they want? And the problem with there being no rules is that this tends to produce something that doesn't add up to a regional network. And as we'll see, the functioning of the network as a network is very important. Now, we've already heard, not just from GRT staff, but also from the GRTC board, a desire that regionally funded service meet some sort of threshold of regional connectivity or regional usefulness. to be eligible, and we'll refine some proposed rules for that. But the other big question is, what's a fair way to distribute service across a region? And by the way, what I'm going to do, since when I'm screen sharing, I can't see the participants very clearly, I will, hang on, I will open up the chat here so that I can keep an eye on that. But I may or may not actually be able to notice those things. So I will stop periodically and ask for questions. Are there any questions or comments yet? Okay, hearing none. The most important thing to understand about transit going into is it's not like parks, it's not like libraries, it's not like a lot of other kinds of public goods that regional agencies like this one get to think about how to distribute across an area. Often when people come to this question for the first time and don't have much background in transit, they try to make it work like parks or libraries, which is to say, well, we need one in this neighborhood, one in this neighborhood, and one in this neighborhood, and we make sure everyone's got one. But transit is not like that, because when we draw a transit line between two areas, we're benefiting both areas at once. And so it's always wrong to say that the service in a particular area is for that area, because the entire line from X to Y is for them both. So this is why we have to be very careful not to just slot into this process of distributing things as though they work just like some other public good that you might be used to spreading around. Now, often starting out, it seems fair to divide up a regional pie using something like population or population plus jobs or local return, that is where the taxes come from. We often start from this perspective of, well, how do we spread it out in response to what everyone's entitled to? But as we'll show, that approach tends to lead to low ridership networks. And the problem with that is that some of your funding sources require high ridership. Some of your external funding sources are tied to the ridership you achieve, and so that money is not there if you aren't considering ridership to a certain degree. And so the challenge is that high ridership transit does not distribute itself evenly by population at all. And let me explain why that is. High ridership transit arises from providing very useful service in places where many people can use it. That is to say, these are places where lots of people can get to a bus stop and where the service can run efficiently to get many people to their destination. And whether that's possible depends on the layout of the community, depends on the geography of the community. So I have to always emphasize, this is not a judgment about your community. This is not saying that your community is good or bad, but there are some geometric facts about different communities that determine whether it's possible to cost effectively get useful service to within walking distance or to within access distance of a lot of people who will find it useful. So there are four basic parts of this, and let's just step through them quickly. These two bus routes have the same cost to operate because they both have two buses on them, but the one in the top image has twice as many people living around every stop. So of course, all other things being equal, there's twice the market where there's twice the density. But since it costs the same amount to go a distance regardless of the density you're driving through, higher density signifies higher ridership potential. It's just the first order estimate of the size of the market. Walkability. Can people around a bus stop actually walk to the stop? This is a problem in much of the post-war development pattern, particularly where things have been built along state highways that were themselves optimized for through traffic. You have on the left the problem of street connectivity, where a highly connected street network, such as you have in the typical pre-World War II urban fabric, makes it very easy to walk to a stop by a direct path from almost anywhere in the immediate area. Whereas where you have strongly divided and discontinuous street networks, like in the lower image, the number of people who can actually walk to the stop gets smaller because the street network walls off some people from access to the stop, even if they're physically close to it. Another important issue that has a big impact on ridership potential is whether people can get to the service in both directions. And in almost all cases, that means being able to get to stops on both sides of the street, which means it must be safe to cross the street. This is also a big issue on a lot of streets, particularly the state highways as you get outside of Richmond, where it simply is not safe to cross the street in very many places. That limits where you can put bus stops, and that in turn limits ridership potential because that limits the number of people who can actually get to the service and find it useful. Linearity, my architect friends all understand density and walkability, but linearity is often something I have to explain to them because it's peculiar to transit. The straighter the line we can operate, the shorter the journey and the more people who will find it useful. So here's two different ways that a town could have been laid out with the same 4 land uses. If they're all in a straight line or all in a couple of straight lines, so that I can connect any 2 of these places with the shortest possible distance, then I have a very high ridership opportunity, because I can provide lots of different kinds of trips with a relatively small amount of service. If, on the other hand, everything is set back, the office complex on a cul-de-sac by the freeway, Walmart set back behind a quarter mile of parking, the college on the hill, etc., those setbacks, which mean that I have to deviate into each of those places, makes the route longer and also makes the route more circuitous and therefore less attractive for people riding through. That's a lose-lose situation from the perspective of ridership. There's no way I can make that as productive as the first kind of land use pattern. So again, that's just a feature of the geometry of how this community is built that's going to have a big impact on where a high ridership network would go. Finally, proximity, and here's where we apologize to the rural counties and probably to Ashland to some degree. It matters how far we have to drive in order to get to you, because that's pure cost. And so it's easier to get more service to a place that's closer in than to further out. Any questions so far about any of those principles? Okay, but is ridership what you want? So I have never worked with a transit agency board that wanted all of its resources to be deployed solely in pursuit of ridership. And the reason for that is, as you've seen, a network designed only for ridership tends to just not go to a lot of places. It tends to just not go to places where the development pattern isn't conducive to it. That's why we have the ridership coverage trade-off, where we always ask boards to think about, okay, how much of your service do you really want to be tied to a ridership goal? And how much do you want to be clear is not really about ridership? So that, and this is very important thing for boards to think about, because it not only gives us some direction from them about what they want the network to look like, but it also sets up realistic expectations for them about what kind of ridership they should expect and what kind of low ridership they should worry about. If you have low ridership on a service that isn't designed for ridership, it's designed for coverage, then it may not be a problem. So is ridership what you want? So here are 2 different ways to serve a little fictional city where the dots represent people and jobs. And so dots close together represent density. And in this simple fictional city, most people live along those 2 major streets that are straight, and then there's a scattering of people everywhere else. So if the goal were ridership, what we do is run the highest possible frequency on those streets where 70% of the people live. And we would not serve the other 30% of the people because there's no high ridership way to do it. The density is too low, the linearity isn't there, and so on. So that's what planning for ridership does. When, on the other hand, we're planning for coverage, we make sure everyone has a little something. And that means we have 10 routes instead of 2, but that means that my fixed resource in buses is spread over all those routes, which means that while the routes in the left-hand image might come every 10 minutes, the ones in the right-hand image come every hour. Because they don't come very often, because they're usually not coming when you need them, the service isn't very useful, and as a result, the ridership is low. So, and that's always what we see. So it's important. You know, people ask me why I want people to think about the ridership coverage trade-off in particular, as opposed to lots of other goals that they bring to this. Well, most of the other goals that people bring to this line up under one of these. If you're thinking like a business, if you're caring about what percentage of your costs you pay out of the fare box, you're going to focus where ridership potential is highest, and you're going to want the one on the left. The one on the left supports dense and walkable development, and the one on the left is what's going to deliver all of the environmental benefits of transit, maximum competition with cars, maximum reduction in vehicle miles traveled, because all those happen as a result of transit being used, not just transit existing. But the coverage goal also lines up with a lot of things that people care about. You're thinking like a public service. It's very hard to oppose a slogan like access for all, which pushes you in a coverage direction. If you represent a low density area, you're going to be drawn to the coverage goal because that's the one that serves you. A principle of lifeline access for people who don't have a lot of opportunities and who could be anywhere is often important. And then there's pure political geography, you know, service to every member city or every member county or every electoral district. So the important thing is that those push us opposite ways. They push us to opposite kinds of network. And so one of the basic questions always is, how do you want to balance these? Now, I mentioned that a lot of goals that people bring to transit line up under one of these. Let me talk quickly about one that doesn't, and that's equity. So if you're thinking particularly in terms of a fair distribution of service in response to both racial justice concerns and in response to just economic justice concerns, making sure that there is mobility there for lower income people, you still inside that context have to have a conversation about the ridership coverage goal, because of course there are people in those categories who live in places that we can serve with high ridership service. That's a lot of the east side of Richmond. But there are also people in those categories living in places where a high ridership network wouldn't go. And so we tend to find that inside communities that are particularly focused on racial or economic equity, they have to have this conversation within themselves because there are reasons inside of that goal to want to go both ways. So in sum, a maximum ridership network, if that were the purpose, it would go along long straight corridors that are lined with many people and many destinations. And it would provide a lot of links between the big regional destinations in the three core jurisdictions, by which I mean the three big counties. But it would not tend to go into rural areas. It would not tend to go to more distant towns in the rural counties. It would not tend to go into single family residential areas in car-oriented development patterns for the geometric reasons I've laid out. And it would not go into industrial parks, by and large, where there may be a lot of employment, but it tends to be configured in ways that are very hard for efficient transit to get to. Now, so when we come at it in the pure sort of territorial perspective, a maximum ridership network will tend to put more service in Richmond. Not because Richmond's special, not because, but simply because more of Richmond's development pattern is of the kind that is favorable to ridership, simply because it's an older city. The other part of this is that Richmond contains the most promising regional job and activity destinations by virtue of the fact that it has destinations that have limited parking. It has destinations that are easily walked to from efficient service, particularly big destinations like VCU, and of course downtown and the state capital area, the state offices. So that's the sort of the problem that comes up when we plan for ridership, and just the fact that planning for ridership obviously is in conflict with trying to get what's going to seem like a fair amount of service to every part of the region. This would be a good place for me to stop and ask for questions, because I'm about to start talking about, okay, if this is the math, what are our options for dealing with it? Any questions at all? None? Everyone's with me? Okay. All right. Let me just keep the chat. Okay, great. So there are three ways to think about dividing up resources. And the rest of this presentation really just invites you to think about these three approaches we could take. Something or other is going to have to be written into policy about what the rules are on who gets what. And I want to remind you right now that we are talking strictly about the regional resources. Every jurisdiction is free to throw in its own money to run as much additional service as it wants above and beyond what the regional formula pays for. And that's very important. So you have to be looking at this not just in terms of, is this all I'm going to get? But, is this a reasonable backbone structure that is fair to my county, recognizing that there are certain kinds of popular services that this regional formula is not going to do, and that I'll have to pay for locally if I want them. So one approach is that the policy could itself be a map of regional corridors. So in this approach, you define a network of regional corridors, you draw a map and say, these are the streets on which the regionally funded service will operate. And those will tend to be the big, obvious linear links between the major destinations, covering as much demand as you can, given the development pattern. And then you negotiate the network rather than any sort of formula for dividing resources. Now, an advantage of this is it helps everyone see that the value you're getting out of the network is not directly related necessarily to what percentage of the service actually operates inside your county lines. Those things are not very closely related because of the network effects. Because, for example, buses that only ran around inside of Chesterfield would not be very useful for a lot of people in Chesterfield whose destinations are in the other counties and so on. And once you run from Chesterfield into Richmond or into Henrico, you're creating something that has mutual benefit. And the mutual benefit of a route from Chesterfield to Henrico can't really be divided up based on how much of the service happens to be on one side of the line or the other, because the point is the whole thing and how they work together. So working with a map is a pretty straightforward way to just make all that really obvious. The downside in our experience is that, first of all, you're locking in a map in policy. And that can be okay if it's the right map. That can be okay if it's a set of corridors that we all really know are permanent and that we all really know are not going to change. And that's possible. But the other then challenge is that everyone has to accept that there isn't a formula behind this. There isn't any sort of principle behind this. And so it becomes a rather straightforward power negotiation about who gets what and how that gets shared. But it's a way to do it, and it's a valid way to do it. A second way to do it is to have a formula dividing service by jurisdictions, a set of rules on what percent of resources go into each county. And in this concept, you have rules that incorporate coverage-like features like population or distance, but you also have ridership driving features like density and walkability. And those all get combined into a formula that produces a set of rules. And then that set of rules is about sort of how much service is in each county. The third, which I want to spend the most time talking about, is the idea of having a balance between a distribution that is more or less by county that generates a degree of coverage, and a distribution and a piece of the pie that is allowed to go wherever the ridership is. So the idea is that you distribute part of the resources as coverage, which might be proportional to population, might be a little bit more for the rural counties that wouldn't get anything useful if you just did it by population. You use the rest to pursue maximum ridership wherever that goal takes us. And the boundary between those two slices is the key policy decision. So let me talk about these quickly. So when you have a map but no formula, you're writing the network itself into the policy. And the map is just whatever the board can agree on, although obviously we as consultants and as staff try to draw a compelling map that really emphasizes the win-win benefits across county lines. It's simpler for the board, but there isn't a hard link to any sort of principle or goal. That is to say, the policy isn't being derived from any sort of rule that can be tied directly to a particular goal. You can do that after the fact. You can reverse engineer that into it, but it isn't driving the policy directly. It locks in a service design, which can be okay if it's the right design, but you have to be sure it is. Now, I want to be clear, we will draw a map in any case. We suspect, and the map will be an illustration of policy options. So whatever kind of formula we end up with, we'll still be doing that. The question is whether the map itself is the policy or whether the map is an illustration of what the policy does. And we suspect there will need to be a formula behind the map to identify some sort of principle and to identify how it follows from goals. But it doesn't have to be. And if you just want the map and the map is the thing, we can do that. And that would be this option, this first option. The second option is a formula for dividing by jurisdiction. And the idea here is that there is a series of weights applied to various factors that contribute to ridership or that contribute to other things that matter to people or that just measure coverage. So the combination of all of this formula would mean that, rural areas would get a little bit. Some would be spread across the whole region, but it would be as a result of this calculation. The formula approach has many factors can go into it. One of the nice things about it is that you can represent equity very directly because you could put in poverty density as a factor. You could even put in minority density as a factor so that those would explicitly be counted. The disadvantage of this is that it's kind of a black box. That when you start asking how each of these factors is weighted, and the weighting is really the big issue. The weighting is really what gives you the answer. You have to get agreement on all those factors. And that can be politically very difficult and both politically and technically difficult for the board because they're really only going to know whether it's right when they see what map results from it. And so this is a common way of doing it. But it has disadvantages in terms of just the opacity of it that people have to think about all these weights and ultimately they have to kind of trust the consultant in a way that I as a consultant don't necessarily always think you should trust me because it puts me as a consultant in the position of suggesting what are actually value judgments. How important is ridership driving factors like population density? How much important is that than an equity factor like poverty or a sheer distribution factor like population? That's actually a value judgment that I would prefer that the board actually think about explicitly, rather than having me come up with factors that somehow actually conceal it in a way. So, which is why we lean toward this third option, which is that the goal question that we put out in front is the ridership coverage trade-off. So the idea here is that the regional money is this pie. And there's a line through that pie that separates service distributed by population, which is essentially what we would call coverage service because it goes places regardless of ridership demand there, as opposed to service deployed for maximum ridership, which goes wherever it would go in order to achieve maximum ridership on the whole network. And the top level policy question then is where should that boundary be between those two slices? And from that boundary follows the map. But the advantage of thinking about it this way is that they have to then think very clearly about this trade-off between competing goals, and it helps the board understand exactly what consequences they should expect as a result of whatever decision they make, both locally and regionally. Now, I want to clarify again what this blue slice means when I say service distributed by population. On a regional scale, that is, relatively speaking, the coverage service. It's service that will be operated despite the fact that it would not be the highest ridership thing you could do in the whole region. And a lot of the service in outer counties is going to be this kind of service. I would say almost all of the service outside the 3 counties is going to come out of this slice. And some of the service in the 3 counties is also going to come out of this slice, where it just does not rise to the level of this will be high ridership regionally. A good example would be orbital service, direct links across the north side of Henrico between the 2 sides, or direct links between Western Henrico and Chesterfield, where neither ends of those lines has a mega destination like downtown Richmond with the huge disincentive to driving that's attached to it. And so ridership potential is lower, and yet it's an important regional piece. That's a good example of the kind of thing that would come out of this blue slice. The red slice, service deployed for maximum ridership. That service would go wherever it needs to go. But when we think about this blue slice, then I'm not necessarily talking about coverage in the sense of going to every neighborhood or going within a quarter mile of everybody, because that's not realistic with this regional money. So when I talk about coverage service in the regional context, I'm still talking about relatively regional coverage service. It doesn't go absolutely everywhere. It still needs to meet some standard of regional usefulness, like connecting across jurisdictions, connecting major activity centers, serving major regional corridors. But it could tolerate a lower ridership relative to operating costs than the ridership service, and it would, as it would need to serve the outer counties and not just cause all the service to go into Richmond. Coverage is this coverage size is in many ways the main reason that the network doesn't all end up in Richmond or just along the very busiest regional corridors, like for example, Willow Lawn to Short Pump. So, so here's how that would work. If you think of it, on the right is a little chart where density is on the x-axis and service quality is on the y-axis. And so the shape of this chart is a policy. It's a policy about how service gets deployed in response to density. So you got rural counties all the way on the left, you got downtown Richmond all the way on the right. A coverage slice generally would be distributed by population, which means still, of course, there's more service at higher density because there's more population. But it means that there is some service all the way down, even at relatively low densities. Again, not necessarily within a quarter mile of everyone, but at least linking significant centers of activity across those whole areas. And so what you do is to say, having split the pie, this coverage slice would be for this, excuse me, I don't know why I'm being harassed here. There we go. This coverage slice would be for something that's in this kind of distribution. Then the ridership slice would be used to go wherever the highest ridership is, and that will concentrate on the higher density areas for the reasons I've explained. So it would give you something like this. A ridership slice would be much more focused on the highest density areas, linking them together, which would provide some service into medium density areas as well, but the effect would be something like this. And so that, yes, you would, as you expand the ridership slice, instead of the coverage slice, the blue bars goes down, the red bars get bigger, and more of the overall network resource ends up in Richmond or ends up in other very high density, high activity places. On the other hand, if you move the barrier inside the pie the other way, so that there's more coverage and less ridership, the red bars get smaller, the blue bars get bigger, and you get more of a distribution that puts more service in the lower density areas. That's the effect of that. Now, the value of actually framing the question this way, as opposed to just saying, let's just agree on what the chart looks like, is that the board actually has to think about what goal they want. And they actually have to own the fact that if the more they expand the blue slice of the pie, the less ridership they can expect overall out of the network. That's just how the math works. So the advantage of this two-formula approach is that it makes clear that this is a policy decision about how much ridership to pursue, rather than just a conversation about who gets how much. The policymakers have one key decision that expresses their priorities, and that's really the decision we need them to focus on. And there's no need to haggle over the details of the formula. What we've done, compared to that previous one where you have a complex formula that includes all those weighted factors, what we've done is say, we're making visible to the board the actual difficult value judgment about what goals this network is ultimately designed for and what balance of goals it's designed for. But we're protected, and we're saying, if you give us that answer, we'll know what to do. Rather than asking the board to get into the details of how a whole bunch of different factors are weighted. So that's essentially the question before us. And now I really want to stop because I certainly hope there are questions at this point before we actually start asking you your opinions on these things. There must be a question, so I'm going to stop until there is.
I have a question. This is Barb Smith with Chesterfield.
Hi.
In developing the CBTA and defining the pots of money, I know with the transit pot, the definition was transit and mobility services.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the discussion around that at the time had to do with, we want to be able to use this money for things beyond just bus service. You know, maybe it's to build sidewalk or trail, or to provide the on-demand service for low-income, elderly, disabled, you know, that population in rural areas where there's no service. So as we're talking about this, is the focus strictly on bus service, or can we use the two formula approach to kind of address that other side of the funding, which is mobility services?
I think that you've identified two big separate categories of investment that you could make, and they have rather different policy consequences. There will be some need for capital, for infrastructure that makes the transit system function. So for example, it happens all the time that we're designing a transit network in a rural area and we need to bring some buses together somewhere and there's nowhere to, and we have to figure out where to do that. And then we have to build a little something that makes that possible. There's also a lot of places, I mentioned an example before, where a crosswalk turns out to be critical, or where improving a sidewalk that connects a transit stop to an activity center turns out to be critical, and it can be nice to have some money for that. So I would say that there's often a category of transit-related pedestrian infrastructure. And you could, if you want to have a pot of non-transit related pedestrian infrastructure, we can talk about that too. The other thing you mentioned though, which is demand responsive service, the challenge there is that is very locally oriented coverage service. And I think we'll find that when you look at, and to some extent, I'll defer to the second part of this conversation, which is where Scudder takes you through how much money this really is and how much this really buys. I think you'll find that very challenging to figure out how to fund all of that and a useful regional network around what this money actually produces. But I don't want to shoot that down. I want to recognize that just figuring out what to do with transit is itself very difficult. And that if counties want to take some of this money out of transit and spend it on other things, well, when we get to the financial tables, you know, we can have a hard look at what that actually means.
I think Jared, to add to that, I think the primary focus of our conversation at this moment is about how to split the 15% part of the pie that is allocated to GRTC for a regional transit network or a regional transit plan or a regional service. And as Jared was saying, like an on-demand service in more rural areas is pretty locally focused. And so there's a fundamental question here of, should that even be fundable out of that 15% part of the pie? I think that's a fundamental question here that we basically have. As Jarrett was alluding to in the discussion about that coverage slice, there may be a minimum kind of rule about that coverage slice if we all decide to go that direction of deciding how to split the resources, that even within that coverage slice there has to be it has to be a regionally significant service or regionally connective type service. The other pieces of the pie of beyond just the CVTA 15% could of course be used however a local jurisdiction, if a local jurisdiction is putting dollars in directly, there's a whole nother conversation separately about how I think a local jurisdiction would ask those resources to be used, and that that could be dedicated to those sorts of things if a local jurisdiction wanted it to. But I think our focus is on this question of this 15% slice and how it gets used.
Better?
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. This is Diana. Yeah, just wanted to just briefly echo what Barb was saying. Specifically, the legislation says the 15% shall be distributed to GRTC or successor to provide transit and mobility services in Planning District 15. So it doesn't necessarily coin everything into regional. I do understand that that is what that is how GRTC is approaching it, but it does say transit and mobility services in planning districts, specifically under the 15%. And it says just simply in planning district 15. So not cohesively amongst, and of course we know the intent, but I did want to just point that out, that it didn't sound like her question was about infrastructure that supported transit specifically, but that may support mobility in a locality within planning district 15, regardless if it's with a transit connection or not.
So I think that this will become clearer when we get to the tables and look at how much money there actually is. I'll admit that we have up to now started from the point that it is going to be so difficult to just get a good region-wide transit system out there for this money that we're not sure how you would do that if we have a lot less money for that, because a lot of funding is going into other things. But that's going to be everyone's decision. And I think you foregrounded an important question that we had not laid out here, which is how much of this money is for transit operations at all. And that's probably a question that we should talk about explicitly, and that we will certainly add to this as another angle on this. But we also want to take you through then, and I'm about to hand it over to Scudder for this, we also want to take you through just a look at how much money there actually is. And when we come out of the design workshop in a couple of weeks, we're going to be able to draw a map of how much transit that actually buys. And then the board will have to look very clearly at, do we want even less than that so that we can invest in these other things? And that's going to be hard. That's going to be difficult. So any other questions or concerns I can raise? I can answer?
Jarrett, this is Chet Parsons. Can you go back one slide to the last graph?
Yeah, sure, I can.
So I know this is conceptual, but essentially is what you're saying is as the coverage slice is reduced, we could lose service at all? I mean, any service in the more rural areas?
I think that in the rural
ridership, the more it's going to focus on the dense areas.
That's absolutely true. And let's distinguish between the truly rural areas and just extensive car-oriented suburban area. Extensive car-oriented suburban area is kind of here, right? These are the truly rural counties. And you notice I drew these two bars the same sometimes it's just not that expensive to go ahead and say, well, there's a minimum level of service that will operate, out to the main town of each rural county, regardless of formula. Just because if you applied a strict, even population-based formula, they would end up with just nothing, not enough to be useful for anything. So sometimes you can do that. So I would not be as concerned about the impact on the outer rural counties. But certainly when you look at, the most lower density car-oriented suburban areas, which are kind of these bars, yeah, they get more or less very directly based on where that boundary is.
And I think to make it even more explicit, Chet, if the board were to say we wanted the regional pie to be 100% towards ridership service, that might mean the regional 15% pot does not provide anything to the areas with just blue bars in here, which means outer auto-oriented suburban areas and rural areas. So that's that is the kind of the value choice here about how to use that how to split that pie.
Let me make this more explicit. Say we're talking about Western Henrico. If you turn the pie completely red, you might end up with, say, a really frequent route along the main corridor from Willow Lawn to Short Pond, and not much else. Whereas if the more you expand the coverage slice, the more you get routes all over Henrico, but correspondingly a lot less frequent, because you've spread the resource thin. And because those routes are less frequent, fewer people are going to find them useful, and that's why they end up being covered services rather than ridership services. That's kind of what that means. And so this trade-off exists inside of each county, right? It's not just an inter-county, what does each county get trade-off? It affects what kind of service gets designed inside of each county. Inside of the 3 big counties.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, I guess my next question is, you all will be providing your expert advice on how this plan should progress over time. Like if there was a ridership focus right now to get the frequency up, how that would unfold over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, and
things.
I'll just say off the cuff that we would generally recommend, board can choose to do this more often, but we would generally recommend that at least every 10 years you do a review of the policy. And we do this a lot. This is actually most of what our firm does, is come in after a system is in place and say, okay, here's the ridership coverage trade-off that your system seems to be expressing right now. Is that what y'all want? Or do you want to turn the dial one way or the other? And then we help them through the consequences of that. So that's something that's good to do every 10 years or so anyway. I mean, we actually, inside of Richmond, when we did the City of Richmond plan, we did that sort of process. We had that sort of conversation. So, you're not, I mean, obviously no elected official will ever let you say that you're locking this down forever. On the other hand, you don't want to change it every week because you want there to be some stability to the policy purpose. And one of the advantages of this kind of structure is if you can get them to write this into policy, then when they come to you and ask for a bus route over here somewhere, you have a way to say back, well, you would have to shift the policy in order for that bus route to be fundable, because right now it would come out of this slice and there isn't enough in that slice. So it's a way, it is very helpful if you want to be able to steer a board back toward the big picture thing that is at stake. See, one of the reasons we developed this methodology to begin with is I had had years of experience watching boards complaining about ridership after they had for years been telling staff to create coverage routes and cut ridership routes without realizing that's what they were doing. And so, we're trying to make, that's why I'm just always trying to make this visible. If you want us to cut that frequency on a ridership route so that you can have a little route you want to go to some development you care about, you've shifted the ridership coverage split, and you need to change that policy if that's really what you want, and you need to debate that with your colleagues. So this has a lot of value down the line in terms of giving the board itself some guardrails.
I want to add in, I guess to Barb as well, just think about the fact that this productivity is going to be important, whether it's ridership or coverage. It'll be designed to be a regional umbrella for a purpose, whether it's ridership productivity or coverage to get you from a neighborhood area to a job. And for that purpose, we will be looking on a quarterly basis at the productivity of that route. Because I mean, the funds will be coming to us and we have to show that we're being good stewards of those funds and using them in a productive way.
But the standards will be different depending on which slice it comes out of, right? So a route that is just not making sense as a ridership route will have to be funded out of the coverage slice. And again, the board can move the boundary in the pie, but they need to do that if they want to have that effect. So that's kind of how this gets maintained over time.
One thing I would add, Chet, to further answer your question is the time scale we're working on in this process is really just looking out over about the next 4 years or so. You know, the CVTA funding kind of came in suddenly without much, without, you know, expectation that it was going to drop in, and now we've kind of got to figure out how to sort out the pie. You know, a full strategic plan process is something that I think the GRTC wants to undertake, you know, probably starting maybe next year. But that's a much longer, more intense 10-year planning process than what we really have the scope and the time to do right now to kind of figure out how to you know, how to work with this new CVTA funding model. But we do want to look out basically over the next 3 to 4 years to set up a network that is reasonably sustainable over that time period, so that you can go through a longer term strategic planning process that really sets you all up for success over the long term. So I think that's kind of what we're aiming for in terms of the time frame of this. Does that make sense?
Yep, thanks.
Okay. Jared, do you want to switch screen share so I can run these poll questions?
Yeah, let me just quickly wrap this up. So the advantages of the two formula approach is, again, you have this one key decision that you focus the board on, and it eliminates that need to haggle over details of the formula. Now, let me say one thing about this poll, because I'm about to hand it over to Scudder. We're about to ask you which of these three approaches I've just reviewed you prefer. I have doubtless leaned into the one that I think we would probably recommend, which is number 3. But the other two have their advantages, and so we do want to. I don't want to feel like you've been in any way pressured into choosing the one we recommend. Choose whichever one you want. If you're genuinely not sure, choose not sure. We want to know that. The other thing I want to say is we hear you about the whole question about whether some of this money is not for transit at all, and that is a separate conversation we need to have. Meanwhile, let's ask this question in terms of, for whatever is going into transit, what kind of approach do you think makes sense for building a policy on how to divide? So with that, I will stop screen share and hand it over to Scott.
Okay, so now I'm going to share screen and then get to the right slide here so that we can try to do this poll. Here you go. So, and so now polling should be open. Do you all see the poll open on rwpoll.com if you're logged in there?
Yes.
Has that popped up yet? Okay, good. So if everyone give us your opinion, if you have questions, you know, we can use a little bit of this time for discussion if you still have questions about this. But number one or A is the map-based approach that we talked about, sketching out the map and then kind of negotiating over that. Number 2 is the formula-based driven approach, where we set up a formula with weights and we kind of have to argue about which which pieces go into the formula, which weights we get used, and then the ridership coverage option. I see, Durana, you're asking about the poll website. The poll website is rwpoll.com. I'll put that again in the chat, and then you enter session ID 316814 when you get to that. So again, rwpoll.com, and then session ID 316814. Or are you not sure? The fourth option, D, if you're not sure which way we should go. So has anyone else who's had any trouble getting to that poll? Okay, hearing none. I see we've got, I think, 13 responses so far. So if I can get my screen share options here out of the way, and I can actually close the poll. And we'll see that. Okay, most of you said the ridership coverage policy approach you feel is the best way to go. Okay. Any, for those who weren't sure, do you have any questions or about these approaches that anything we can answer that would help clarify your thoughts? Okay. So the next question is about that question, I guess, that kind of came up in conversation with Barb's question during our discussion time about, should we have some limits even on that coverage service slice if we're using that policy approach that can be funded out of this 15% CVTA distribution. So should we have some limits that say there has to be some usefulness to a relatively, significant number of people, meaning, there's what is drawn or what is funded through that coverage oriented slice, the 15%, still has to be some kind of a major link, still has to be some kind of regionally connective service that's not just purely local, such as a demand responsive or just a local circulator within a one activity center, for example, or one town. So should we limit that? We've had some clear indications from GRTC staff and as well as board that they would prefer that there be some limit like that.
Can I clarify?
Yeah.
What we're asking here too, that if you want this money to go to mobility services, if you want this money to go to something other than fixed transit, then you're a no on this question. Is that right, Skinner?
Correct.
Okay. Just want to be very clear on that.
Correct. So the actual poll question, and let me open the polling now, is should all resources be limited in a way that tends to serve more people, i.e. so for example, not local circulation in low demand areas. That so if you are a yes on this question, you're saying that even that coverage slice has to have some rules about it being somehow regionally significant or regionally connective or regionally useful. If you are a no on this question, you're saying there shouldn't be any kind of limits on even that coverage source slice of the pie of the 15%. And if you're not sure, then you're not sure where you fall on this question.
Hey, Scudder, this is Barb.
Yep.
It sounds like once you start talking about the money, I'll be able to answer this question better.
Okay.
Right now I have sunshine and roses dreams.
Okay. Well, since I've already opened the poll and we have some answers, maybe if you're not sure at this point, you can just say not sure. And we can come back to this question. That's the beauty of this, is I can rerun the question. And we can see what you say after we've talked more about the money. That sound good? Okay. All right. See, we've got 12 responses. So I'm going to say we're going to close polling in 3, 2, and 1. And polling is closed. Let's see. Okay, so about half of you said yes, there should be some kind of limitation. Nearly half of you said not sure, and probably, I guess, one of you said no, there shouldn't be any limits. So, okay, that is a helpful starting point, and we'll perhaps come back to this question after we've had some time to talk a little more about the funding. Okay.
So Scudder, can I add one thing? This is Chet.
Yeah.
I think that for me, that question is specific to the use of CVTA funds.
Exactly.
Right. Yes, absolutely. That's what we're talking about.
That's different than what our overall hope is for transit in the region.
Exactly.
Yes, and I absolutely, almost all of this we need to be sure. We're talking about primarily how we decide to distribute that 15% of the CVTA distribution. You know, any locality can basically decide to effectively buy service and or create transit service of its own. I mean, some of you already do that. The Access Chesterfield is a transit service, and you all are doing that independently. So that is, you know, that is not that is something everyone can choose to do. So let's talk a little bit about the pie. How big is the pie? How big, you know, what is the financial projections look like? So we've been working on that over the last month, trying to kind of update what does the financial picture look like, so that we have a better sense of how much is there to distribute. So I just want to start by talking about kind of the baseline years, I'll call them both baseline years in a way, of 2019 and then FY 2022, which is what we're coming up on right now. And I call them baseline years because we've got, you know, a proposed budget for FY 22 based on keeping the existing service running as is. And we have proposed funding from each locality in the proposed FY 22 budget. But FY 19 is a good baseline for us to think back on as well, because that is the last fiscal year where things were reasonably normal before COVID. And so it gives us a kind of reasonable baseline of service levels and costs and funding, kind of before the world has just been completely jumbled in the last last year or so. So we'll refer back to 2019 here and there. And it's also, we have pretty solid ridership numbers. We have very solid service numbers and so on to draw on. So I want to start it off just pointing out, what did the operating contribution revenue picture look like in 2019? What does it look like in 2022? So 2019, you had about 460,000 revenue hours of service. And we'll refer regularly to revenue hours of service because that is the service quantity. That is kind of what you're buying. It is one revenue hour is 1 hour of a bus running on the street. Or if you're thinking about on-demand services, it's paying, you know, one driver and one operator to run a service for 1 hour. We don't really have that right now except for paratransit. But we're talking about primarily fixed route service here. So in FY 2019, you had, you know, about 15 million coming from the city of Richmond, about 8 million coming from Henrico, and about 118,000 coming from Chesterfield County, with that getting 400,000 revenue hours for the city of Richmond, 53,000 revenue hours for Henrico County, and about 1,000 revenue hours for Chesterfield County, adding up to that roughly 460,000 revenue hours of service. FY 22, what we know is there will be basically 534,000 revenue hours of service. That's what's in the proposed schedule, which is basically continuing what has been run since last year. That is an increase from FY 2019. There's been additions. The 111 obviously is a new service. There's been expansion of some service in the city with the extensions and changes to the 50, the 77, and other routes. So there's been an increase in service, you know, since 2019. And with all of this change in the CVTA and the regional contributions from CVTA, Henrico and Richmond obviously have used that 50% cutback option at this point to cut back. So at this point, kind of the baseline we're starting from in FY22 is the assumption that the city of Richmond is putting in about 8 million, and Henrico County putting in about 4.2 million. Chesterfield about 1.2 million, which is up in part because of the 111, for example, as new services, adding up to about 41.6 million. So that seems like a big increase in operating contribution. It obviously is. It's 18 million more roughly in local operating contribution. Does that mean we can do a lot more service? Well, there's a lot of factors here that we have to think about in whether that can buy a lot more service. One is there's already significantly more service in FY 2019. And then we have to look at the expense side of the equation as well. Just to go through a few other elements from the 2019 kind of baseline that we're talking about. If we look at the federal, the state, the fair elements of contributions to all revenues, in 2019 it was about 8.4 million in federal, which is a sizable part of the GRTC distribution of 5307 funding, which gets to that question of how much should be going to operating, how much should be going to capital, because that is a pretty sizable portion of the GRTC's federal distribution. There is about 9.8 million coming from the state, and there was about 7.4 million coming from bus fares and passes for a total of 25.6. And if we look at that kind of total, most of the funding is coming from either local, regional, or federal or state and fares. There's a little bit coming from other sources. And if we look at how much of that is actually buying you regular transit service, fixed route transit service, that adds up to 52 million in revenues in 2019, but only 88% of that is actually going to fixed route service because you have to fund the paratransit. You effectively have to fund it first in a way. You have to provide that if you've got fixed route service. So that obligation is kind of off the top. And that is about 88%, or that's about 12% paratransit is in 2019, which means 88% of that revenue can go towards actual fixed route service, actual transit service for the general public. And if we look at the cost per revenue hour in 2019 and in 2022, we see that wages, benefits, and other things have raised the cost of what it takes to run just any revenue hour of service. It was about $99.6 in the 2019. It has risen to about 105.03 in 2022. So the revenues have gone up since 2019. The service levels have gone up since 2019, but also the cost per service hour has gone up since 2019, which creates, and that trend unfortunately has looks to be continuing for the next few years. So we have developed some forecasts to look at what is the potential with this new funding setup and what could it buy. So if we forecast outward to 2026, what is possible on a relatively conservative projection? If we presume that contributions grow basically at roughly a 3% level each year from local jurisdictions, so just a little bit ahead of inflation. So City of Richmond, Henrico, Chesterfield keep putting in basically what they are proposed to put in this year, plus 3% each year roughly. And the CVTA funding grows roughly at the projected levels, then by 2026 you'd have almost 46 million coming from the local and regional sources. I would note this CVTA number that we have in here of 30.6 million is actually a little bit lower than the projections from the state in August. Ryan Ferguson, who's on the line, and the team from Baker have been working and looking over those sales tax projections in detail and looking at economic projections. And we've, based on their look at, the likely growth pattern in sales taxes from now into 2026, given our hopeful recovery from COVID, the state projections from August seem relatively rosy. So that 30.6 is a little bit lower than what the state had in August. I think it was about 32 million was from the state projection in August for FY26. If we look at the other contributions, The federal, if we assume approximately a similar 3% growth, and also a roughly 3% growth of the state contribution from FY22 to FY26. Then we look at buses and fare passes. Fare revenue has been down. We expect fare revenue to once you start charging for fares to come back, but come back somewhat slowly. It probably will not be back to the roughly some odd million you had in 2019. It will be hard to get back to that quickly. So the low end assumes fare growth of 2.5% over the FY 2022 projection. The high end of our forecast assumes a 3.2%. At the end of the day, that doesn't end up being a really dramatic difference, given we're only talking about 6.7 versus 6.8 million here. So that would rough out to basically a little over 29 million from those.
I might mention that there was a question in the chat about the implications of a zero fare policy, and this slide is your answer.
It is, yes, that does partially answer what are the implications of the zero fare policy. And that is another part of the discussion we can have here as we're talking about what options to look at. And I'll get to that later on in this discussion. But yeah, the effect of a zero fare policy, at least just on the revenue side of things, would be, roughly in the range of $6.8 million in lost revenue. There's a whole nother question about what it means for the effect on your operations, because no fare generally means higher ridership. It generally means higher ridership, particularly in dense, high ridership oriented places, which can swamp your capacity. So there's a two-part question if we want to get into the zero fare question, but I want to pause that for a minute until we get through all of the financial elements. So if we boil that down, if we add all of that up, it adds up to something of, roughly on the low end, 79.1 million, on the high end, 79.7 million in total revenues by fiscal year 2026. If we presume that you still have to fund paratransit roughly at about 12% of total revenues, that would leave about $69.6 to $70.2 million that could fund fixed route service. So if we look at that number then, and we talk about what could that actually buy you in fixed route service, in the FY22 baseline that we're looking, as our kind of starting point from today, a revenue hour costs about $105. Looking at recent trends, a low end estimate of what you could actually fund would presume costs rising at a relatively high rate of growth, above inflation. And if we were to presume that costs escalate at a 4.8% rate per year, so the actual cost of providing just what you have today, the cost per revenue hour, if that escalates at 4.8%, which has been relatively close to what it's been the last couple of years because of some significant jumps in benefit expenses, for example. But also we're in a strange moment with all of the COVID costs and all of that. But that would lead to a fiscal year 2026 cost per revenue hour of $126.49. So with that forecasted $79 million, that would buy you 550,000 revenue hours, which is only 3% more than today. It's not a lot more than today, unfortunately, because that cost growth really adds up quickly. If costs can be held down, and that means there's various ways to, but a lot of it boils down to labor cost. And costs only go up overall about 3%, 2.9% to 3% per year. Then the cost per revenue hour in 2026 would be basically $117, $116.99. And that would buy you 600,000 revenue hours. But even that is only about 12% more than today. So it's not a really, really big jump from today. So, what does that mean to that question? If we're assuming that everyone basically keeps contributing at the same level as projected in FY 2022, the pie doesn't really grow a whole lot. And the implications then are, for example, if you want that 15% of the CVTA pie, if you want to have a significant portion of that be coverage, that makes it much, much harder to fully backfill the existing service that, you know, is no longer being funded by that cutback from Richmond and Henrico, reducing their investment. So, you know, there's a big question here about whether locals want to expand the pie by expanding their own investment in service. And then a bigger picture question, of course, is the more you want to expand the pie, the more you want to expand service in general, the larger the potential capital implications are. Because you need to buy more vehicles, you need to, you know, pay for stops, shelters, and other things. And so you need to grow the pie even more than just the provision for additional operating of service. You kind of need to grow a larger and larger slice for capital as well. So there are these, you know, challenges of the more you want to grow, kind of the more it takes to grow, in a way. Big picture. So that is the kind of big picture summary of the forecasts. And so I want to pause here because I know that's a lot of information, and you probably have some questions about this.
Scudder, let me just say this back in hopefully a clarifying way, and you can tell me if I have this right. All of the numbers you've shown on this slide presume that all of the resource goes into transit operations.
Yes.
When you say that at a cost escalation of 4.8% a year, at the end of the day, we only have 3% more service than today, then any non-transit investment out of this money reduces that number.
Precisely.
Okay.
Exactly.
Scudder, this is Barb.
Yeah.
It seems like hoping that costs escalate only 2.9 per year is really optimistic, just from what I hear at GRTC board meetings. They are having such a hard time getting operators that really increasing wages, their benefits, all of that stuff leads me to think that 2.9 isn't even something that is feasible. I don't know if I agree with 4.8, but.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's, I mean, Adrian can perhaps speak in a little more detail to this. She and I have had a little bit of conversation about this, and the challenge with operators isn't so much the pay rate, it is more the standards for your driving history and your ability to get CDL. Adrian, do you want to talk a little more to that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we are definitely getting applicants in, Barb, so it's about kind of filtering them out throughout the process. One of the factors is, of course, the CDL. We are currently in conversation of maybe exploring kind of an alternative, smaller vehicle that doesn't require a CDL for routes that have smaller capacities. And that would kind of give us a bigger pool with a different kind of mode. If that does work out, we're considering maybe piloting that in the near future with some of those lower capacity routes, especially during COVID, since we're having even more operator issues than normal. That would give us a bigger pool of resources and a different pool than we have today. So that would allow us to hopefully have the resource to grow to get those revenue hours. I do want to add that the projections for 2022 we're optimistic at the time, kind of pre-COVID, so they might be a little bit closer to more than 2019, but a little bit closer to that. And we will refine those as we go through the budget process for 2022.
And I should also clarify that. I should also clarify that you know, we've been working over these numbers with Adrian and others at GRTC, but this is also still somewhat preliminary. We're still working over these estimates and these forecasts, and of course. GRTC has a new CFO that's starting tomorrow. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So there will be some refinement, of course, once the new CFO is in place. But we wanted to, you know, I think the big picture here is still quite valid and accurate. That you know, the forecast of what's available from or what you could do if the CVTA money grows as projected, and if the local contributions grow as projected and stay at the current levels they are, 50 50% reduced from what they were in 2019. The pie just as a big picture doesn't grow that much. So that's just kind of the fundamental challenge.
Scudder, there's a question in the chat that I want to surface. Lisa Guthrie asks, so if this illustration designates everything to operations, how should we factor capital into our financial calculations? Now, there's a bullet at the bottom of this slide. But again, am I right that these numbers you're showing us here assume that none of the regional money goes to capital?
Correct. Right now, they've showed all of it going into operations. And the more you want to grow, the more you would probably have to invest in capital. Now, I think there's an important point here about, we're talking about kind of forecasting what's possible by 2026, given the effective overall cash flow of things in 2026. Because the CVTA money is effectively already flowing in the door, in a way, it's kind of stacking up. So there is this potential for, once the CVTA money starts flowing, there will effectively be kind of a pot that you could use for capital early on, because it's effectively stacking up now. But of course, once you've used that pot, it's gone. There's still a long-term question of what you do for kind of continuing capital investment, which has to be answered. But some of that obviously can only be answered once we have some sense of what is the growth in operations as well. So there's a little bit of an iterative process we're trying to work through here. And we're kind of starting from the big picture of what's possible at a high level, looking at it with everything going to operations, but we may still have to cut back from that. Does that make sense?
This is Diana.
Yeah.
I just had a quick question. Oh, pardon me, I'm sorry. Just on the heels of doing the transit governance report and talking about cost of expansion and capital replacement and effective cash flow, is there some from your experience, Jared Walker's experience, in regard to the way that the current funding model that GRTC has, meaning local subsidies with some other operating dollars and now this regional pot, is there some other ways that we could get to the outcomes, such as like bond leveraging or the borrowing ability? Just asking, as we're kind of in the midst of the transit governance report as well.
Well, I mean, bonding capacity is obviously only going to help you potentially on the capital side of the equation. And I think the significant challenge I think that we want to talk through here is, I think there are some relatively high expectations that this new additional funding will pay for a significant expansion in service, and that's got to be funded long term and out of operations. And so we're trying to talk through, what is that long-term operating funding level that we're hoping to increase. And then we can solve, it will then be easier to solve for what the capital needs will be and whether bonding capacity might be part of that.
Yeah, I completely understand. I mean, even with the about 11 million and even, probably particularly the 11 million, which is then 8 million coming to operating preventative maintenance, that even that 3 million becomes potentially operating ability annually based on that bonding capacity being there for capital purchasing.
So you mean the pot of federal dollars going to capital, roughly $2 to $3 million a year being bondable?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that could potentially. I mean, I think that gets into that gets a little deeper than I really wanted to focus on right now, and it's a little.
Oh no,
No, but I don't know if it is, I don't know if there's enough there to bond in a way that would get you anything, because a lot of that's probably going to, ongoing vehicle replacement cycles and potentially other fairly basic capital investments that you may want to make in other improved capital items. If we're talking about as large enough expansion in service, for example, if we're talking about everyone coming to the table with additional local money so that the pie is more like a plus 20% situation, then you're talking about needing capital for just more garage space and things like that potentially. So there's a whole lot of potential capital needs that bonding capacity might help you in the short term, but you've got to think about, of course, the long-term vehicle replacement cycles and all of that you need that stream for continuously.
Scudder,
Okay.
if I could just clarify, I don't think we do want to get too far into the weeds, but to these questions, just know that the background on the financial projections have already removed some currently as unspecified funds. They're termed right now as either institutional reinvestment or a capital operating reserve, and that amounts to almost $1 million in 2026. So that's not even presented here in the number Scudder's presenting. So I just wanted to let you know, we tried on the financial team to present the pot that you all can start making the policy decisions for. The exact numbers, we don't want to get too much into the weeds of their projections, but just wanted to say there has been money removed from this consideration that could be to bonding, to cash flow. It's there. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you.
So any other questions on these projections so far and what this, the big picture, what this means? So how could we distribute this pie, this pie of dollars, if we're talking about how it gets distributed? There's kind of two approaches that we think are logical here and deciding how you distribute this pie. One is to basically distribute the revenue hours or the dollars ultimately, but we want to think about it in revenue hours because that's service quantity terms. Distribute it to each entity meaning the local or regional contributor, based on the portion they're contributing to the pie. And that would mean that the federal, state, and fair portion of revenues would basically get distributed by how much each entity is putting in. So each entity would get a share of that federal operating contribution, state operating contribution, and the fair revenue relative to how much each entity is putting in. An alternative to that is to reserve that federal, state, and fair portion of the revenues specifically for yeah, we're running long. Okay. Sorry, Lorna. I think we go to 11:30. Is that right? Okay. Yeah. There's just a little bit more, so I think we should be able to close up on time. Sorry. The other option is to take that federal, state, and fair portion of the pie of revenues, for example, and dedicate that solely to ridership maximizing service. Kind of put it in that same bucket with the CVTA ridership maximizing portion of the pie. The reasoning for that is it would put those external revenue sources in a bucket that maximizes those same revenue sources, because state formulas kind of prioritize ridership improvement. Fares obviously are maximized from having high ridership oriented service. And even the federal formula has a degree of focus on about a quarter or so of it on the ridership level that you get. And that would put it in a separate bucket that kind of maximizes those same external resources. So we can look at kind of what would this look like in just rough distributional terms, using the same assumptions I just showed you about what FY26 might look like. So in FY26, if those projections are of local and regional contributions are what I showed you, the CVTA dollars would basically be 67% of the local and regional share. City of Richmond would be 20%, Henrico 11%, and Chesterfield 3%. And then excuse me. These are the revenue hours you would get for each slice of that pie, effectively, depending on the low end or the high end of the forecast. So, 67% of the revenue hours would go to that CVTA portion of the pie to be distributed based on the ridership coverage policy that everybody agrees on. Then Richmond would control basically, or have, a strong say in how much 20% of the pie is in their in the city for roughly 110,000 to 118,000 revenue hours, and Henrico, based on their contribution, 57 to 63,000, roughly in that range, and so on. So that is roughly how it might be distributed by entity in that scenario. If we were to take the federal state fair portion into a separate ridership-oriented bucket, that would then kind of split it up into these 5 pieces of pie. The federal state fairs bucket being a ridership-oriented bucket, that's about 39% of service, about 213 to 233,000 revenue hours that would be going to ridership maximizing service. And then 41% is CVTA. Again, this all aligns with approximately the actual contributions, putting about 220 to 240,000 revenue hours in the CVTA bucket to be distributed by the ridership coverage policy that we decide on. And then each entity getting its share of the pie once we distribute it by these 5 different approaches. So does everyone understand the difference in kind of deciding how to slice up the pie?
Scudder, let me just clarify. The argument for federal state affairs being in a ridership bucket is that they are derived from ridership.
Yes, that the formulas used to distribute those funds either significantly or have a significant part of their formulas based on ridership.
So if you're not getting high ridership out of that money, you end up not getting that money.
Or you get less money, or yeah, exactly. So Lisa was at.
I would just point out, if you decided to do this, then the CVTA money distributed by policy could logically lean more toward coverage, because some of the ridership work is being done here by the ridership bucket.
Right. So this has some bearing potentially on what you decide about how you distribute the CVTA dollars. Lisa was asking about what about the other counties. So what we're talking about here is distributing by how much each is putting in terms of dollars invested. If if Hanover, if anyone else decided to directly invest, they would get a slice of the pie relative to their direct investment. But also each jurisdiction would get some piece of this CVTA distribution based on whatever policy direction we're given about how much to put into ridership versus how much to put in coverage. So jurisdictions would get something out of this slice based on that ridership coverage conversation, and any jurisdiction that's directly buying in would get some distribution based on that amount they're putting in. Does that make sense? So the big question then is whether we split out this federal state fairs portion as a slice of the pie to be distributed in a ridership bucket or not. And that's the last big question I have for you on the polling question. So polling is open about which approach you would prefer of these 2 ways of kind of breaking up the whole pie of service, whether it is to distribute things to the regional and local entities purely by their contribution, which would mean splitting up the federal, state, and fair bucket evenly across each by their contribution, or to put the federal, state, and fair revenues into a separate bucket to maximize ridership investment out of those resources. Any questions on that poll question? Okay, I see we've got a few responses. I'll give folks another couple seconds here to answer. I see some chats here. Jarrett, you were saying that outside of the 3 counties, yes, would have to be based on the coverage slice of the CVTA distribution, unless an individual jurisdiction decided directly to buy in somehow.
Which, yeah, this is just, I mean, local jurisdictions can always put their own money in.
Yeah.
But in terms of this formula, yeah, that's in response to Lisa Guthrie's question.
Yeah. Okay. So see, we've got 10 responses, 11. I'm going to give you all just a couple more seconds here. So in 3, 2, 1, polling is closed. And what did we get? So a lot of not sure, 45% not sure, about 45% of you at putting the federal state fairs into a ridership bucket. But it seems like this is something where many of you feel we should put it into that ridership bucket, but many of you are not quite sure yet about what's the best, about what direction we ought to go. Okay.
Can I mention? Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No. You go ahead, Jared.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. That's fine.
All right. So just kind of coming back then, based on what we've been talking about, is if we're going to use this ridership coverage policy, then that CVTA bucket, this kind of answers that question again, would be split based on that ridership coverage policy, which would really need to come from the board, and that value question answer from them about how to split that up. The important point, I think, at a high level about these financial projections and about this ridership coverage question is that the larger that coverage slice is of the 15% of CVTA funding, in particular, if we distribute evenly, if we don't put the ridership, if we don't put the federal, state, and fairs portion in a ridership bucket, the larger that coverage piece of the pie is, the harder it is for us to backfill that service in Richmond and in Henrico due to the 50% reduction since 2019. So that's just putting that whole kind of big picture in perspective about what that means to the ridership coverage question. So that question is one we will be putting to the, or at least introducing to the GRTC board on the 19th. But it's also a question that we could explore in the next steps. So we're going to refine these financial projections over the next 2 weeks, and then we're going to develop some alternatives for public and stakeholder consideration, for your consideration, for the public's consideration. We are planning on a core design retreat the 19th through the 22nd, so that week of MLK, and we will be inviting you to participate in that, where we will try to draw up 2 different alternatives of how you could split that pie, and how it might look differently based on some policy choices. I'd say the really key element of determining kind of how big that pie is to get some sense from you all of, are your jurisdiction's local contributions, do you anticipate them significantly changing from what we've projected? So, do you all at, the city, at Henrico, at Chesterfield, or any of the jurisdictions, do you anticipate your contributions, direct contributions to GRTC for service over the next few years increasing at all, in order to grow the pie, to grow the amount of service you have in your own jurisdiction that you can basically have a say over? Because that obviously grows the pie overall, it grows the service you have in your own jurisdiction, and it changes the overall math somewhat. So that's a really important question that we need your thoughts on in the next 2 weeks in order to kind of help us sort out what alternatives might look like in that workshop. So the last thing to talk about is, we are scoped to design 2 alternatives, and those alternatives could explore a couple of different questions. They could explore what if we answer this ridership coverage question differently? What if we answer the ridership coverage question, at a 90-10 level or a 60-40 level or something, some difference in that question. Alternatively, we could make a basic assumption about that based on input from you or input from the GRTC board in particular or others, and look at a different policy question. For example, we could look at the policy question of what happens if you have zero fares? What does that mean? What does that mean in terms of a different financial projection? You don't have the fare revenues coming in. So there's that part of the bucket that's gone, the pie that's taken out. But also there are some implications for service, because we know that would have a significant increase in demand for service, particularly in the densest parts of the region. Or we could explore a different question of, what does it look like to design something based on the forecast that I've shown you for FY26? And alternatively, what does it mean to design a network where there is, a projection for more investment from any of the local governments? Assuming assuming any of you decide, all of you potentially decide to put in a certain amount in the future, and what does that look like? So there's basically an option here of, we could explore one of these questions in designing these alternatives, and which of these do you all feel is the best policy spectrum to explore here?
Scudder, it sounds to me as though there's also now this issue about whether money needs to be taken out for non-fixed route purposes. And I think my suggestion about that, Barb flagged this issue, I'd like to know what Barb thinks, that we need to sketch something that basically spends this money on fixed route so that you can see what it means to have less than that. So that the board can see what it means to have less than that. It always happens that the language around getting the money approved is very, very broad. And then this is the point where we start saying, whoa, that's all the money this is. What does that actually buy? And I would be concerned that if we took money out of this for mobility services right at the beginning, we'd end up with a fixed route network that just is so thin that it isn't even functional. But I think once you see what kind of fixed route network we buy, then you can think more clearly about, can we trade off some of that? Do we want less of some of that so we can have some of these other things? Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense and seems like a good approach.
Okay.
I have one comment. This is Dirona. Just in regard to the question about distributing the pie and such as by revenue hours. I know that with the city of Richmond and the grant structure that we work, we currently don't operate under a service agreement in that format. And there is some work I think that would have to be done before we could transition to that format, which I think ultimately says buy-in that by revenue hour, how the city will be charged, one based on long-term contribution and equity into the system. But I did want to just make that comment as we look for a uniform way for this to work across all of the jurisdictions.
Can if I understand what you're saying, that you're suggesting there are challenges to shifting to a model where everyone gets some revenue hours based on their contribution. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I don't know. I think, I don't know that it's a huge issue or not. Because I don't really know how it plays out on what services we get now and for how much. So I'm just saying that the revenue hours format per revenue mile has not been what City of Richmond, how they have funded GRTC.
Right. I mean, and I think I mean, I think just at a very high level, this entire shift in structure from a purely local funded kind of model to a shared regional local funding model kind of ultimately blows up every kind of historical pattern of how things have been funded and distributed. And we're trying to develop a model of transparency here for everyone, that is clear to everyone, and that is also at the end of the day reasonably fair to everyone. So it's it's a long-winded way of saying this enormous change in funding streams and patterns kind of means that everyone's kind of historic approach to this gets kind of swept away in a way, at least at a big picture level. I don't know if there's a
yeah, I understand the concept in that, but if there's again been 40 years of investment into the company, then I just think that there's some recognition of that as we move forward and grow in the system.
Well, I think we need to. So I think we've got to be clear about what the operations of service every year pays for ultimately, versus the capital assets question. Because every year you pay for operations, that's just the operations. That at the end of the year you've paid for the operations, and that's the service that you paid for. I think the other side of this to think about is, if this all sorts itself out in a way where the regional dollars and other things are emphasizing high ridership service to a significant degree, that will ultimately mean that a significant amount of investment from these external resources are going into the city long term. So that is in a way that is a kind of perhaps meeting your equity goals in a way long term. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right.
To add to that, a little bit more granular, but like Scudder said, every jurisdiction will, you guys have created different buckets. If we do move into that model, you now have a ridership bucket and then the CVTA bucket. Typically, the jurisdictions, City of Richmond included, is just not written the same way, but on our invoices, they get a subsidy for ridership, and they also right now, they get a subsidy related to care, which City of Richmond is getting as well. It's just not written out in an invoice regularly. That will change the way that's seen, and that will be also reflected in the contracts probably moving forward. So it won't just be the City of Richmond, but we'll all work with it together. But drawing it out first and seeing how that impacts and shifts what the current funding does, I think will get us there.
Okay. So let me come back to the kind of policy spectrum question here, because we're about done. We're almost at 11:30. So, and I went ahead and opened this poll, but the policy spectrum question here of what we explore in these alternatives we draw is a really important question for us to consider here, because it boils down to what is the range of possibilities that you all want to look at and want to consider. So do you want to consider different ranges on that ridership coverage spectrum with respect to how the CVTA pie is split, for example? Because we could assume a certain amount of funding in 2026. If we set that, as what I just showed you, or some modified version with, additional investment from localities, if you all decide you want that pie to be bigger based on the forecast of additional investment, whatever that is. But we set the investment level, where it is, and then we just change how that pie slice is distributed. That's one way you can look at this. A second policy question is the fare question, whether to have zero fares or not. I know there's been discussion of that, but that's a very different policy question, which changes that investment in that pie calculation. Or we can decide based on input from anyone what a certain ridership coverage split should be, and look at a larger pie with additional investment from locals, or just continuing with what we forecasted. So I'm curious about what it is you all want to explore in this range of alternatives to think, to help you, to help the public, to help your elected leaders think about what it is you want this CVTA funding and the overall regional network to look like between now and 2026. Any questions about what we're asking here?
Hey, Scudder, this is Tiffany.
Yep.
Where it's simpler fares, could the idea float around about a standard fare across versus different fare models for jurisdictions, for example?
So I mean, a zero fare versus simpler fare scenario is assuming that in a scenario in the future where you still have fares, but your fare structure is just simpler. You still, maybe the base fare is still just $1.50, but it's a simpler fare structure. And you have an express route fare that is the same for all express routes, something like that. So it would still potentially be simpler than existing fare structure, but you would still be aiming to kind of keep your fare revenue levels roughly the same overall. Good question. Any other thoughts on this? I see we've got 7 responses. I'll give you all another few seconds to answer this. And in 3, 2, 1, we'll close polling. And all right, most of you are interested in looking at the ridership versus coverage. So looking at differences in how we split that. So that's a useful way to help answer that policy question. So that sounds like the direction we want to go here. I would say that it's really important to get your feedback and thinking about these forecasts for investment. So one of the things that we will do at the end here, after this meeting is over, is we have a detailed spreadsheet that shows these projections and includes tabs that show the low end and the high end projections, so you can look at the forecast in more detail. And importantly, there is a tab in there where we have plugged in different numbers for local investment for the future, where you could make different assumptions, and you could plug in different numbers there if you want to say, okay, hey, Hanover is willing to put in, say, $1 million in 2026 to get some, guaranteed service for us that we kind of control. Or Chesterfield wants to add more service in the future that we have more direct control over on our own. And it would show you what how that changes the total and how that changes the distribution. So we'll send that around to help you kind of investigate those possibilities, because we would want your input very soon about whether we should make different assumptions on the local funding contributions over the projections for the next 4 years. Any questions on that?
Hey, Scudder, this is Tiffany again. Kind of related to the future forecast, and I'm sorry if I overlooked this when you were discussing this earlier. How much did you guys count for in terms of the requirement about the baseline 50% and then the increase based off the average consumer price that would start in FY23 for the localities?
So we have assumed so let's just start back here really quick. We have started from this proposed FY22 in the GRTC's proposal that Julie went over, I think, at the board meeting in December. And we have just consistently grown that by 3%. So this is the assumption for those numbers by 2026. That is probably a bit above the pure CPI assumptions that's in the legislation. So you all could tell us that you don't think you're going to actually put in that much, that you're going to stick to just purely the CPI, but that would affect the size of the pie.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions before we wrap up? If not, so we'll send you all that spreadsheet today as a follow-up, so you can explore those forecasts a little more and explore what the implications of any changes in your investment levels would have on revenue hours. And if you have questions on that spreadsheet, feel free to give me a call, and I'll make sure you all have my contact information in that when we send it out. But thank you all. I think this has been a very helpful conversation.
Thank you. It was great.
And also look for our invite for your participation in our core design the week of the 19th through the 22nd. So we'll be working on that organization as well.
The time commitment with that, Scudder, what that would look like.
Well, I think I still need to work that out with you, Adrian, a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scudder.
Thank you.